we're going to have this shoulder flexion, and we're going to have the client laying supine, which is on the back. We're going to place the fulcrum, the center of the fulcrum with the goniometer at over the lateral aspect of the greater tubercle. And we're going to have the proximal arm parallel to the mid-axillary line of the thorax. I'm going to have the distal arm aligned with the lateral midline of the humerus. And the client go raise their arm all the way back as far as they can go. Okay, shoulder flexion, MMT, manual muscle test, and we will be stabilizing the scapula and palpate the anterior deltoid. And I'm going to have the client raise arms straight up, and then I will be applying resistance at the distal end of the humerus. Okay.
Awesome.
Okay. Shoulder. Okay, this is the shoulder internal rotation. Client is laying supine, and we have the elbow flexed at 90 degrees and the shoulder flexed at 90 degrees. We're going to place the fulcrum over the olecranon process, have the proximal arm parallel to the floor, and we are going to be having the distal arm aligned with the ulna, and we're going to have the client move their hand downward. Okay, we're doing the shoulder internal rotation manual muscle test, and I place a towel under the arm. The client is laying prone, which is on their stomach, and they have their shoulder abducted to 90 degrees, and I have stabilized under their arm at the end of the humerus. And what I'm going to have the client do, I have palpated at the teres major and latissimus dorsi, and what I'm going to have the client do is slowly move their palm of the hand up towards the ceiling as far as they can go. You don't want to overextend it. And then I'm going to apply resistance at the distal end of the vulvar surface of the forearm. Okay, we're doing the shoulder horizontal adduction, and so we have the client sitting up. We have their arm extended fully to the side. I'm going to place the fulcrum at the acromion process, and we have the proximal arm across the shoulder towards the other acromion process, and we have the distal arm following the humerus, and we have the client bring the arm forward and across his chest. Okay. Shoulder horizontal adduction manual muscle test. We have the client laying supine on their back with the shoulder abducted to 90 degrees. Yes. And elbow flexed. We're going to stabilize the scapula. And we're going to palpate at the pectoralis major muscle. I'm going to have the client have their arm towards the opposite shoulder, move their arm towards the opposite shoulder. And I'm going to apply resistance at the distal end of the humerus. This is the elbow flexion, and we have the client laying supine, and we have their arm fully extended, palm facing the ceiling, and we're going to place a towel under, and we're going to place the center of the fulcrum at the lateral condyle, and the proximal arm will be at the lateral midline of the humerus, and the distal arm will be aligned with the lateral midline of the radius. I'm going to have the client bring their arm up and fully close it. This is the elbow flexion manual muscle testing. We have the client sitting up elbow extended, arm adducted at the shoulders, and I'm going to be stabilizing at the humerus and palpating at the biceps brachii. And I'm going to have the client with their palm of the hand facing the ceiling, bringing it toward their face, flexing. And then I will be applying resistance at the volar aspect of the forearm. We'll just still end. Forearm supination, and we have the client sitting up, flexing the elbow at 90 degrees, and their thumb is parallel to the ceiling, and we are going to be placing the fulcrum at the medial proximal end of the styloid process, and we're going to have the client turn their arm palm up, and their hand palm up towards the ceiling. Okay, this is the forearm supination manual muscle test, and the client is sitting up, having their elbow flexed at 90 degrees. I'm going to be stabilizing the humerus and palpating the sup. I'm going to be palpating the supinator muscle, and I'm going to have the client turn their palm facing the ceiling, and I'm going to apply resistance at the volar distal end. Okay, we're doing wrist flexion, and I have my client sitting up and the elbow flexed at 90 degrees. I'm going to be placing the center of the fulcrum at the lateral aspect of the triquetrum, and the proximal arm will be laterally midline of the ulna, and the distal arm will align with the lateral midline of the fifth metacarpal. I'm going to have them look down. And you stay with the fifth metacarpal. You don't actually follow the fingers.
We're going to be doing shoulder extension. We're going to line up the fulcrum with the lateral aspect of the greater tubercle, which you can find by finding the acromion, dropping down. And then we're going to line the proximal arm up with the mid-axillary, and the distal arm is just going to follow the humerus as my client goes into extension. Just like that. Now we're going to do manual muscle tests for shoulder extension. So first, I'm going to palpate the posterior deltoid, because that's what we use for shoulder extension. I'm going to stabilize the scapula. I'm going to actually apply resistance at the distal end of the humerus down towards shoulder flexion. I'm going to ask my client to go ahead and go into extension. I'm going to do goniometry for external rotation of the shoulder. We're going to have the client have their arm abducted to 90 degrees, elbow flexed to 90 degrees. We're going to put the fulcrum at the olecranon process. The proximal arm is going to stay up towards the ceiling or parallel to the floor, and the distal arm is just going to follow the ulna into external rotation. So go ahead and bring your arm down towards your head. Keep going as far as you can go. And boom, just like that. Okay, we're going to do manual muscle tests for external rotation. We're going to have the arm abducted to 90 degrees, elbow flexed to 90 degrees. I'm going to put resistance at the distal end of the forearm, and I'm going to put my hand under the humerus to stabilize. And I'm going to push towards internal rotation while my client goes into external rotation. Doing goniometry for shoulder abduction to 90 degrees or shoulder abduction into the air. I'm going to place my fulcrum at the greater aspect of the tubercle, or you can line it with the acromion. Either one works. We're going to have the proximal arm down towards the floor, and the distal arm is just going to follow the humerus as it goes up towards the ceiling. So muscle tests for shoulder abduction to 90 degrees. We're going to palpate the middle deltoid muscle, and then we're going to put resistance on the distal end of the humerus down towards adduction, and I'm going to stabilize the scapula. I'm going to ask my client to raise her arms towards the ceiling. Perfect. Okay, we're doing goniometry for horizontal abduction. What we're going to do is we're going to align the fulcrum with the acromion. We're going to have the proximal arm towards the other acromion across the shoulder, and then the distal arm is just going to follow the humerus as the client goes into abduction. This is for horizontal abduction. Okay, we're going to do manual muscle tests for horizontal abduction. We're going to have our client with their arms up. We're going to stabilize the scapula. You want to feel the posterior deltoid, and I'm going to apply resistance towards the distal end of the humerus towards adduction. We're going to be doing goniometry for elbow extension. We're going to align the fulcrum with the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. The proximal arm is going to stay up here with the acromion, and we're going to have the distal arm just follow the radius. So go ahead and go into extension, and again, this arm is just following the radius. You might get a little hyperextension. We're going to be doing manual muscle tests for elbow extension. I'm going to palpate the triceps muscle. I'm going to apply a little bit of support for the humerus towards adduction, and then I'm going to supply resistance towards elbow flexion while my client goes into extension. And the resistance at the distal end of the forearm. Okay, we're going to be doing goniometry for elbow pronation. I'm going to put a towel by my client's torso for support, and so she doesn't go into abduction. You're going to align the fulcrum with the styloid process, and since she's going into pronation, I'm going to have her start with her hand in neutral, fulcrum lines with the styloid process, proximal arm is down towards the floor, and the distal arm is just going to follow the wrist over as it goes into pronation. And you don't want it too tight because you don't want to cut anything off. We're doing manual muscle tests for pronation. I'm going to provide support at the humerus so she doesn't go into abduction. We're going to provide resistance at the volar end of the forearm as she tries to pronate. Oh my God.
Okay.
We're doing manual muscle tests for pronation. First, we're going to palpate the pronator. Then we're going to provide support at the humerus so she doesn't go into abduction. We're going to provide resistance at the volar end of the forearm as she goes into pronation. And last one is wrist extension, right? We're going to do goniometry for wrist extension. We're going to align the fulcrum with the triquetrum. That's a little dip in the hand. We're going to align the proximal arm with the ulna, and then the distal arm is going to follow the fifth metacarpal as the client goes into extension.